The courtroom at Welbridge Assizes had been built to make small men feel large and frightened women feel smaller, and on the third morning of the inquiry into the death of the late Earl of Carrow, it had done precisely that to everyone but the woman in grey at the back of the gallery. She sat very straight on the hard bench, her gloved hands folded over a worn leather folio she had carried for 5 years. And she did not weep, and she did not look away from the man in the witness box, who was lying with such practiced ease that half the room had already begun to believe him. Lord Ashworth, the new Earl of Carrow, cousin to the dead man and heir to everything that had been taken, spoke in the warm, unhurried voice of someone who had told the same story so many times that it had worn a groove in him. He had loved his cousin. He had wept at the graveside. He had only ever wished to set the estate in order after the tragedy. To the room, he was grief made respectable. To Eleanor Vance, who had been governess in that house and had buried the truth alongside the truth-teller, he was the most accomplished liar she had ever watched draw breath. And the strange, cold thing in her chest was not fear. It was the certainty that she was about to do something she could not undo. Stay with me a moment, because what she did next took less than a sentence, and it cost her everything she had spent 5 years protecting. To understand the question, you must first understand the silence. 5 years before that morning, Eleanor had come to Carrow Hall as governess to 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 9, the wards of the late Earl. She had been 24, then the daughter of a country clergyman lately dead, with no fortune, no connections, and a quality of attention that the marriage market had no column for. The Earl had been a kind, distracted, scholarly man who treated his servants as people and his books as friends, and the house under his hand had been one of the few corners of England where Eleanor had felt the rare luxury of being looked at and not measured. She had loved the children. She had loved the work. She had loved, though she had never permitted the word to form. The long winter evenings in the library when the Earl's nephew came down from London and sat across the fire from her and argued about poetry as though her opinion were a thing worth fighting. That nephew was Captain Henry Renfield, and he was not the new Earl, and that distinction was the whole of the matter. There had been one evening in particular in the second winter of her service that Eleanor returned to more often than she allowed herself to admit. The children were abed, the Earl had retired with a headache, and she had gone to the library to return a volume of Cowper and found Henry there before the fire, with a book unopened on his knee, looking at the flames as though they owed him an account of something. She had moved to withdraw, and he had said, without turning, that she need not go on his account, and that the room was large enough for 2 people who wished to read in silence. So she had stayed. And the silence had not held, because she had been unable to resist remarking that he had been holding the same unopened book for a quarter of an hour, and he had looked at her then with something that was nearly, not quite, amusement, and asked how she could know that when she had only just arrived. She had not answered, because the true answer was that she had noticed him through the half-open door before she entered, and that she had been noticing him for longer than was sensible. And the noticing was not a thing she could say aloud to the nephew of her employer across a library at night. They had argued instead about the poem. He held that Cowper's God was a frightened man's God, all retreat and trembling. She held that there was a courage in writing tenderly of small, safe things, when one had known the opposite, and that retreat chosen was not the same as retreat compelled. He had gone quiet at that. He had looked at her a moment too long, the half-second longer than other men, and he had said that he had not considered it so, and that she was probably right. And the granting of it had warmed her more than the fire. She had carried that warmth up 3 flights of stairs to her cold, narrow room, and lain awake holding it, furious with herself, telling herself that a governess who let herself be warmed by such things was a governess preparing her own unhappiness. She had been right about that. She had been warmed anyway. It was in that same library a month later that Henry had seen the thing about her. He never afterward forgot, though Eleanor had not known he was there to see it. The younger child, the boy, had broken a small porcelain figure that had belonged to the late Countess, a shepherdess. The Earl kept on the mantel, and valued past its worth, and the boy had been white with terror at what he had done, and the housekeeper had been all for fetching the Earl directly. Eleanor had knelt on the cold floor among the pieces, and taken the child's face in her hands and told him the truth, which was that the figure could not be mended, and the Earl would be grieved, and that the grief was the boy's to carry honestly and not to hide, and that she would go with him to confess it, but that he must be the one to speak. She had not lied to him. To spare him, she had not taken the blame upon herself, though it would have been easy, and the Earl would never have known. She had given the boy the harder kindness of his own honesty, her hands steady at the back of his head while he wept. She had walked him to the Earl's study and stood beside him while he confessed in a wavering voice. And the Earl had been grieved and had also been moved, and had forgiven the boy and praised the governess in the same breath. What Eleanor had not known was that Henry had been in the deep chair by the window the whole while, hidden by its high back, and had watched a penniless woman, with everything to gain from a great house's good opinion, choose instead to teach a frightened child the costly habit of truth. He had said nothing. He had simply added it, silently, to the account he was keeping of her, the account the county knew nothing of and would not have believed. Henry had no claim on Caro. He was the son of the Earl's late sister, a soldier home from the peninsula, with a limp he would carry to his grave, and a manner that the drawing-rooms of the county found unpardonably grave. Where Lord Ashworth was all warmth and motion, Henry was stillness. He stood at the edges of rooms. He answered questions a half-second after other men would have, as though weighing whether the answer was worth the breath. The county had decided he was cold and proud and disappointed in his prospects, and the county was wrong about all three, and Eleanor had known it was wrong within a week of meeting him, because she had watched him carry the smaller child up 3 flights of stairs every single night. The boy was feverish, and never once let the household see him do it. This is not the story of how she came to love him, though. That had already happened, quietly, years before the courtroom, and both of them had buried it, as carefully as they buried everything else. This is the story of what she knew. What she knew was this. On the night the late Earl died, the house had been told that he had passed in his sleep, peacefully, of a weakness of the heart that had troubled him for years. Lord Ashworth, summoned from London with startling speed, had taken charge of everything within a day. He had been gentle with the children. He had been generous to the staff. He had produced within a week a will that named him sole heir and guardian. A will witnessed and sealed and entirely correct in its forms, and the county had murmured how fortunate it was that the poor man had set his affairs in order before the end. Eleanor had been the one to find the Earl, not the valet, not the housekeeper. Eleanor, who had gone to the library at midnight to return a book the elder child had borrowed, and had found the old man slumped over his writing desk with the candle still burning and his hand still curled around a pen, and a letter half written beneath it. She had read 3 lines of that letter before the housekeeper's step in the corridor sent her heart into her throat. 3 lines. They had been enough to tell her that the will the county would soon admire was not the will the Earl had meant to leave, that he had discovered something about his cousin that had made him take up his pen at midnight to undo a great wrong, and that he had died before the ink was dry. She had taken the letter. God forgive her. She had taken it and hidden it inside the leather folio that held her own small papers, and she had told no one because she was a penniless governess with no protector. And the man the letter accused was about to become the most formidable person in her world, and she had 2 children to think of who would be utterly at his mercy. She had been afraid. She had been right to be afraid. And the fear had calcified over 5 years, into a silence she wore like a second gown. The county, in those 5 years, had a name for Eleanor Vance, and the name was a small cruelty repeated until it became a fact. The morning after the funeral, when she had stood pale and silent at the edge of the mourners, Lady Ashworth, the new Earl's mother, a dowager of formidable composure and diamonds that caught the church light, had murmured to the rector's wife in a voice pitched to carry, "The governess," she had said, with the smallest curl of the lip, always lurking where she is not wanted. One does wonder what such women hope to gain. The rector's wife had not disagreed. No one ever disagreed with the Dowager Countess. And from that morning forward to the society of the county, Eleanor was the governess who lurked, the plain woman of no fortune, who had attached herself to a great house and could not be got rid of, and every kindness the late Earl had shown her was reread, in the bright, unforgiving light of the dowager's verdict, as evidence of her grasping. Henry had heard the verdict. He had been standing close enough at the graveside to hear his aunt deliver it, and Eleanor had watched something move across his face like the shadow of a cloud over a field there and gone. And then he had turned and looked at her across the open grave, with an expression she had not been able to read for a year afterward. She had read it as contempt. She had been wrong about that, too. The reason the matter had come to the assizes at all after 5 years was a development no one had foreseen. The elder ward the girl had come of age that spring, and with her majority came a question about a portion of property settled on her by her late guardian, a small estate called Thornley, that lay at the edge of the Carrow lands. Lord Ashworth had let it be understood that Thornley had been sold to settle the late Earl's debts the county had never known existed. The girl, however, who was clever and stubborn and had been taught by an excellent governess to ask exactly who profited from a thing, had engaged a solicitor of her own, a sharp young man named Mr. Pell, and Mr. Pell had begun to ask the kind of questions that did not have comfortable answers. There were no debts in the records that justified the sale of Thornley. There was a sale, certainly, and Thornley now belonged to a gentleman who happened to be the husband of Lord Ashworth's sister, and the money had gone somewhere. The books did not show. The matter had grown, as such matters do, from a question of property into a question of the will itself, and from there into a formal inquiry, and the inquiry had become the thing that filled the courtroom at Wellbridge on a cold grey morning in the 3rd week of Michaelmas term. Eleanor had not been called as a witness. She had no standing. She was the former governess, dismissed in all but name when the children were sent to school, living now in 2 rented rooms above a draper's shop in the town, on the small annuity the late Earl had been generous enough to leave her, the only line of his true intentions that had survived. She had come to the courtroom as a member of the public to sit at the back, to watch, because the girl she had taught was fighting alone against the whole machinery of the family, and Eleanor could not stay away. She had told herself she came only to lend the silent comfort of a familiar face. She had not admitted, even to herself, that she had brought the folio. The trial went badly for the girl from the first hour. Mr. Fortsell. Pell was clever, but he was young and outranked, and the family had retained the most expensive counsel in the county, a barrister named Sergeant Hale, whose voice could make a jury feel that doubt was a kind of bad manners. Witness after witness was produced to attest to the late Earl's failing health, his confusion in his final months, his absolute trust in his cousin. The housekeeper, grey now and frightened, testified that the old man had spoken often of his cousin's kindness. The valets swore the Earl had been too weak to write his own name in the last weeks. And Lord Ashworth himself, when he took the box, was magnificent. He grieved. He forgave. He expressed only sorrow that his cousin's poor ward had been so misled by an ambitious solicitor into dragging the family's tragedy through a public court. He looked at the girl when he said it, with such gentle pity that 2 of the jurors looked away from her in embarrassment. At the first recess, Eleanor had gone out into the cold corridor to breathe, and there, by ill fortune, she had come face to face with the Dowager Countess herself, who had paused in her progress to the family's private room and looked Eleanor up and down with the unhurried thoroughness of a woman pricing a thing she did not intend to buy. The Dowager had not raised her voice. She had not needed to. She had said to the companion at her side, but loudly enough, that she saw the governess had come to feed on the family's misfortune, as she had always fed, and that some women had no occupation in life but to hover at the doors of their betters and wait for scraps. She had let the word governess fall like a coin onto a counter, the small contemptuous chime of it, and she had moved on without waiting to see it land, because in her world it did not occur to her that it might not. Eleanor had stood very still in the cold corridor, with her gloved hands folded over the folio, and had felt the old shame rise, and for the first time in 5 years had felt something else rise beneath it, that was not shame at all. She had not yet had a name for it. She would find the name an hour later when she stood up. When she had gone back inside, she had to pass the end of the family bench to reach the gallery stair, and Henry had been seated at its near end. And as she passed, close enough that her gray skirt brushed the head of his cane where it rested against the bench, he had not looked up at her, but his hand had moved. It had lifted from the cane's head, a few inches only, the way a hand lifts when it means to reach out and catch a sleeve, and then it had stopped and closed, and gone still, and returned to the cane. The whole of it had taken less than a breath, and no one in the crowded room had seen it, but Eleanor, who saw everything he did, because she had spent 5 years cataloging the smallest motions of a man she had told herself she did not watch. She had felt the near touch on her skin where no touch had landed. She had carried it up the gallery stair as she had once carried the warmth of a granted argument, and she had not understood even then that the stopped hand was the truest thing anyone had said to her all that terrible morning. Eleanor sat in the gallery and felt the room turning, the slow tide of belief moving toward the man in the box, and she understood with a sick lurch that the girl was going to lose. Thornley would be confirmed, sold. The will would be confirmed valid, and Lord Ashworth would walk out of the courtroom not merely uncontested, but vindicated, the wronged and patient cousin, while the truth lay where it had lain for 5 years, inside a leather folio on a governess's lap. Across the courtroom, on the bench reserved for the family, Henry Renfield sat with his hands folded over the head of his cane and his eyes on the floor. He had not testified. He had refused to testify. The town whispered, refused to speak against a cousin who was about to be confirmed master of everything, and the county read the refusal as the sulk of a passed-over man. Eleanor watched him from the back of the room, the grave, still profile she had spent 5 years trying not to remember, and she saw that his jaw was set in a way she knew, a way that meant he was holding something so tightly it had become physical, and she wondered, not for the first time. Sergeant Hale was rising to his final summation when the thing happened that no one in the room had planned. The girl in her distress half rose from her seat and turned to look back into the gallery, searching the rows of strangers for one face, and she found Eleanor's, and for an instant the whole of her child's fear was naked on her grown woman's face. It was the look of someone going under, and Eleanor, who had spent 5 years being careful, who had built her small, safe life on the foundation of one buried letter and one kept silence, felt the careful thing inside her simply break. She stood up. She should not have. A woman of no standing did not rise in a court of inquiry and speak. The usher started toward her. Sergeant Hale paused. With the affront of an artist interrupted, the magistrate, an old gentleman named Sir Roderick Kelm, who had known the late Earl, peered over his spectacles at the gray figure in the gallery with more curiosity than anger. And into that suspended, scandalized silence, Eleanor Vance asked her one question. She did not accuse. She did not declare. She asked in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the room a single question directed at the man still standing near the witness box. If the late Earl was too weak to write his own name in his final weeks, she said, then who wrote the 3 lines of the letter found beneath his hand the night he died, in his own clear script, naming the wrong he meant to undo? The silence after was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of a room in which several people had stopped breathing at once. Lord Ashworth's face did not move, and that stillness was its own confession, because a man with nothing to fear would have frowned, would have asked what letter, would have laughed. He did none of those things. For the space of 3 heartbeats, he simply looked at her, and in that look Eleanor saw the exact moment he understood that the one variable he had never accounted for in 5 years of careful arrangement had been a penniless governess with a good memory and a folio on her lap. Then the practiced warmth poured back over his features like water closing over a stone, and he turned to the magistrate with a small, sad smile, and said that he had no notion what the woman meant, that she was a dismissed servant with a known grievance, that the family had long been troubled by her. The governess, he said, One does wonder what such women hope to gain. He had not known he was quoting his mother. The Dowager Countess, seated rigid in her diamonds, had gone the color of ash. The magistrate, however, was no longer looking at Lord Ashworth. Sir Roderick Cullen was looking at Eleanor, and he was an old man who had spent 40 years on the bench learning the difference between a grievance and a fact, and he asked her, quietly, whether she had this letter. Eleanor's hands were shaking now. The thing was done and could not be undone, and the fear she had held at bay for 5 years arrived all at once, but she opened the folio with steady enough fingers and drew out the single folded sheet she had carried since the night the candle burned, and she said that she did, and that she had found it beneath the late Earl's hand, and that she had been afraid, and that she had been wrong to be afraid for so long, and that she was not afraid any longer. And then she could not say anything more, because her voice had finally failed her, and she stood in the silent courtroom with the letter held out before her like a thing that might burn. It was Henry who came. He rose from the family bench, and his cane struck the floor once, and he crossed the open space of the courtroom in the uneven stride the peninsula had given him, and he did not go to the magistrate, and he did not go to his cousin. He came to the gallery rail, to her, and he stood below her, where she stood above him, and he looked up into her face with the expression she had misread for 5 years, as contempt, and understood now, far too late and exactly in time, had never been contempt at all. He held up his hand to her, palm open. An old soldier asking a frightened woman to come down out of the dangerous height she had climbed to. And he said her name. Not Miss Vance. Not the governess. He said Eleanor Lowe, the way a man says the one word he has been forbidding himself for years, and the saying of it in that room before all those people was itself a kind of testimony. She put the letter, and then her hand, into his. What followed took the better part of an hour, and need not be told in all its particulars, because the law moves slowly, even when the truth is suddenly plain. The letter was examined. The late Earl's hand was known to a dozen people in the room and was sworn to by 3. Mr. Proggan. Pell, who could scarcely believe his fortune, established within 20 minutes that the script of the letter matched the Earl's correspondence and bore no resemblance to the will, and that the will's witnesses had both conveniently left the county within the year. Sergeant Hale's magnificent voice grew quieter and quieter, and Lord Ashworth, who had built 5 years of comfortable mastery on the certainty that the only person who could contradict him was dead, sat down slowly on the family bench, beside his ashen mother, and did not rise again. The part that mattered, though, the part Eleanor would remember when the legal particulars had blurred, was that Henry did not let go of her hand through any of it. He stood beside the gallery rail and held it, in full view of the county that had named her grasping. And when at last Sir Roderick Cullen adjourned the inquiry pending the proving of the true will, the old magistrate looked at the two of them, standing joined at the rail, and then at the broken man on the family bench, and he permitted himself, for the first time in the proceedings, the ghost of a smile. Now you know the question. Stay until the end, because the courtroom was not the end of it, and the part that comes after is the part the county never quite forgave them for being so happy about. The true will, when it was proved that Winter told the story the 3 lines had only begun. The late Earl had discovered in his final year that his cousin Ashworth had for some time been quietly stripping the estate of its movable wealth against the day he might inherit, selling timber and plate and the contents of a London house, and entering none of it in the books, on the comfortable assumption that an old scholar absorbed in his Greek would never look. The Earl had looked. He had been a gentler man than the discovery deserved, and rather than expose his cousin to ruin, he had meant only to change his will, to settle Thornley and a proper portion on his 2 wards beyond his cousin's reach, and to leave Ashworth the title and the entailed land and nothing more to steal. He had sat down at midnight to write the new will out fair, in his own hand, and he had written 3 lines of the letter that was to accompany it, explaining to his solicitor what he intended and why, and his heart had stopped between one word and the next. Ashworth, arriving with that startling speed, had found the body and the half-written letter both, and had taken the letter, and had not found the second thing, because the second thing was already gone. The governess had reached the library first. The new will the Earl had meant to sign was never found, because it had never been written past its first clause, and so the law could not simply install it in place of the false one. The letter, however, did something the missing will could not have done so cleanly. It proved intent, and it proved fraud, and it shifted the whole weight of the inquiry. Thornley was restored to the girl. The hidden sales were traced, slowly and with much unpleasantness, and the money that could be recovered was recovered. Lord Ashworth kept the bare title, because the title was entailed and could not be taken from him. But he kept little else, and he removed himself and his mother to a modest house in another county, where the story had not yet arrived, though stories of that kind travel, and it arrived soon enough. The Dowager Countess, before she went, did a thing that surprised everyone who had ever heard her speak of the governess who lurked. She came, alone and unannounced, to the 2 rented rooms above the draper's shop, and she sat in Eleanor's plain parlor, with her diamonds left at home. And she said with great difficulty and no warmth at all that she had been mistaken in her judgment of the matter, and that she did not know how to do this and would not attempt it twice. It was not an apology, as a gentler woman would have made one. Yet Eleanor, who understood exactly what it had cost a woman like that to climb those narrow stairs, accepted it as the larger thing it was, and gave the dowager tea, and let her go with her dignity, because Eleanor had never in her life wanted to humiliate anyone, and that, in the end, was a great part of the difference between her and the family that had named her. As for Henry and Eleanor, the county watched them with the avid attention it reserved for any romance that violated its sense of order, and it found a great deal to disapprove of. He was the nephew of an earl, grave and landed at last by the small competence his uncle had after all. Left him in a codicil that turned out to be perfectly genuine. She was a governess of no fortune, who had hidden a letter for 5 years out of fear. The drawing rooms decided on the whole that he was throwing himself away, and they said so, and neither of them cared in the slightest, which the drawing rooms found most provoking of all. He came to the rooms above the draper's shop one evening in early December, when the first snow of the winter was sifting down past the window and gathering in the angle of the casement, and he sat across from her in the small firelight, as he had once sat across from her in the great library at Carrow, because they had both spent so many years not speaking, that the habit was slow to break. The folio lay on the table between them, empty now of its terrible secret, holding only her own small papers again. Henry looked at it, and then at her, and he said in the low-level voice that the county had always mistaken for coldness that he had known about the letter. Eleanor went very still. He had known. He said, not its contents, but that there was something. He had stood at the graveside 5 years before, and watched her face when his aunt spoke her cruelty, and he had seen on it not the guilt of a grasping woman, but the particular dread of a person carrying a weight too heavy to set down. And he had spent 5 years certain that Eleanor Vance knew something about his uncle's death, and was too frightened to tell it. He had said nothing because he could not be sure, and because to ask would have been to put her in danger from the very people she was hiding from, and so he had done the only thing he could think to do. He had refused to testify, refused to lend his name to a verdict he did not believe, and he had waited, year after year, watching her from across rooms, trusting that whatever she was carrying she would one day be brave enough to set down, and praying he would be near when she did. "I was near," he said. "That was all I asked." It was the longest speech she had ever heard him make, and it undid her more thoroughly than any declaration could have, because it was not a declaration at all. It was an account of 5 years of patience she had read every day as contempt. She had thought herself entirely alone in her silence, and she had not been alone, not for a single day. He had been standing at the edge of every room she was in, waiting, the way he had carried the feverish child up 3 flights of stairs where no one could see, doing the unwitnessed kind thing because it was the kind thing and not because anyone would know. She told him then about the night in the library, all of it, the candle in the curled hand and the 3 lines, and the housekeeper's step in the corridor, and the fear that had closed over her like water and not let go for 5 years. She told them about the children, and how she had stayed silent for their sake first and her own sake second, and had let herself believe the order of those two reasons mattered. She told him she had been a coward. And Henry listened the way he listened to everything, a half-second longer than other men. And when she had finished, he did not tell her she had not been a coward, because he did not lie to her, not even kindly. He told her that courage was not the absence of 5 years of fear. It was a woman standing up in a courtroom at the one moment it could not be taken back. He told her that he had loved her since the second winter, since an argument about a poem she had won, and that he had said nothing then for the same reason she had said nothing, because they were both people who had learned to carry things in silence, and that he was finished, now, with silence. He reached across the small table and took her hand, the same hand he had taken at the gallery rail, and he turned it over in his, and looked at it as though it were a thing of value, the hand that had carried the folio for 5 years and finally opened it. She was aware of him then with a sudden completeness that had nothing to do with thought, the warmth of his palm against hers, the faint scent of cold air and wood smoke he had carried in from the street, the slow, careful pressure of his thumb at the base of her fingers, as though he were learning the shape of a thing he had long been forbidden to hold. Her heart was loud in her own ears. She had spent 5 years schooling her body to give nothing away in rooms full of people who would have used it against her, and now, in the firelit quiet there was no one to hide from, and her body told the truth it had always known. The lean of her toward him before she had decided to lean, the breath that would not quite steady. He felt it. She saw him feel it, saw the grave dark eyes change, and he stopped. He did not draw her closer, though she understood now that he wished to, because they had both come to the edge of a thing that could not be unmade, and he would not have it made in haste. Not after 5 years of silence, not for her. He held her hand, and he held himself still, and he let the moment be what it was, a question and not yet an answer. And the restraint of it moved her more than any boldness could have done. Outside, the snow came down past the glass. The fire settled in the grate. And Eleanor Vance, who had been told by a whole county that she was a woman who lurked where she was not wanted, found that she was wanted, exactly here, exactly as she was, and that the wanting had been there all along, standing patiently at the edge of the room, waiting only for her to set down what she carried and turn around. They were married in the spring, quietly. In the small church where her father had once preached, with the 2 former wards in attendance and Mr. Pell beaming in a new coat and not a single diamond in the building. The county did not approve, and was not invited. The girl whose stubborn question had begun the whole unraveling stood up as a witness and cried without dignity all through the service, which Eleanor thought was precisely the right amount of dignity for the occasion. Thornley was hers again, and she gave the use of part of it, in time, to a small school for the daughters of clergymen, with no fortune and good minds, because Eleanor remembered what it was to be a girl of quality. The world had no column for, and she meant to build a column. And on the first night in the house that was now their own, when the unpacking was done and the staff had gone to bed and the 2 of them sat at last in their own quiet firelight, Eleanor took the worn leather folio down from the shelf where she had placed it and opened it. And from inside it she drew out, not the terrible letter, which was the law's now, and locked in a strong box, in Mr. Cobble's, Pell's chambers, but a single dried sprig of rosemary she had pressed into its pages on her first winter at Carrow, when the old Earl had cut it from the kitchen garden and told her it was for remembrance, and that a house with no one in it to remember was only a building. She had forgotten it was there. She held it up to the candlelight, the brittle gray-green of it, the small, dry ghost of a kindness done years ago by a gentle man now 5 years in his grave. And Henry leaned his grave dark head close to hers to look at it, and neither of them said anything at all, because some silences are not the kind that need breaking. The candle burned. The folio lay open and empty of everything, but rosemary, and the house, which had stood quiet so long, had at last someone in it to remember. If Eleanor's question stayed with you, stay a moment longer in the quiet of it before you go. And if her courage moved you, you are welcome to say so. Some stories are only buildings until someone remembers them aloud.